we looked last week at the great hymn writers and sang some of their hymns, only some of their hymns. A lot more we could have sung. But I thought we'd have a look, just a couple of modern hymn writers. Between 1900 and 1950, the Church of England in England was spiritually barren. Church life was in decline and church music was in decline, and so there's not a great deal of good stuff comes out of that. But since then, there's been a continued decline in the mainstream churches. The Church of England in England is not doing well at all. But evangelicals, after 1950, breathed a whole new life into the church. And in conjunction with the charismatic movement, English church music has come to life because of that. The evangelicals got organised for a change. The InterVarsity Fellowship was the evangelical attempt to influence university students. When I went to university, the Evangelical Union was part of the IVF, and we used to have lectures once a week, Wednesdays, in Lecture Theatre 1, and there would be more than 200 people at it. It was quite amazing, and we had some brilliant lecturers, absolutely brilliant lecturers, some really great names. Allied to that, then, the InterVarsity Press began to publish books which were theologically good, biblical, cheap and popular. And that had a huge influence on the church. Evangelicals, who had up until the 50s been sort of seen as not being particularly academic, you know, we were fundamentalists, we just believed in the Bible, we didn't want any of this liberal stuff. Well, suddenly evangelical scholars, biblical scholars, started to make their presence felt. So people like F.F. Bruce, it didn't matter what tradition you came from, F.F. Bruce, you couldn't fault his scholarship. And he was a New Testament scholar, although he wrote on all sorts of other things. He was professor at Manchester, I believe, and a lovely guy. His daughter lives in Sydney, or lived in Sydney, I don't know whether she still does. So he used to come out every so often, and he'd come to Moore College, and when I was on the staff there, we had lunch together a couple of times. I. Howard Marshall is another name, and there are lots of others, but I. Howard Marshall became one of the great New Testament scholars, on the book of Luke and Acts, he was probably as good as anybody in the world. And then there were the great preachers, John Stott and Martin Lloyd-Jones, and a lot of others who had actually gathered a huge gathering, and then through them other evangelicals grew up and other churches and so on. So there was a whole change in church life, and it was at the forefront of a musical revival in church music. And so there are just a couple to look at, not so much about them, but Timothy Dudley Smith is one. He was an evangelical bishop, would you believe? And he was very instrumental in the production of a book called the Anglican Hymn Book, and another one, Psalm Praise. We'll look at Psalm Praise later. He's probably best known for Tell Out My Soul, which has become a classic, a standard. He wrote lots of other hymns, but they are not really hymns that we've tended to sing over the years. Others like Michael Saward, James Seddon, Margaret Clarkson, Vernon Hyam, we tend not to sing their stuff. And even Graham Kendrick, whose name I know well, I looked at what he'd written, and we tend not to sing much of that. Stuart Townend, however, we sing here quite regularly, How Deep the Father's Love for Us and In Christ Alone. Now these are the traditional hymn writers who are still doing what the great ones that we looked at last week are doing. Unlike the modern, I guess you'd say, songwriters who are writing what we used to, when I was a kid, call choruses. They're not choruses, but they're not the old-fashioned hymns. I'm not going to say any more about that because frankly, I don't know a great deal about it. But what about Christian music in North America? We didn't get to this in the first week, and this is particularly important because it greatly affects what we do. There are two key factors. Historical problems. I want to talk about that because one of the difficulties in dealing with America is discovering what's true. Because as you probably noticed, Americans are really good at blowing their own trumpet, really good at developing history that isn't really history. Americans who are so patriotic actually don't have much good history at school at all. And so they really don't know much about the truth. And although this is not really relevant, but I want to share it. This is a bit of research that I did, and I'll tell you at the end why Christian music comes into it. But it's very, very difficult to work out what is fact and what is fiction. The man on the left is Cecil Sharp, who lived from 1859 to 1924. And he was an English musicologist. And what he's doing there, he's actually sitting with his notepad with an old guy up in the mountains of the Appalachian Mountains, listening to the old guy sing folk music and note it down. He was very famous. He actually was in Australia in 1882. He was an organist at St Peter's Cathedral in Adelaide. He was a conductor of the Government House Choral Society, the Cathedral Choral Society, the Adelaide Philharmonic Orchestra, the joint director of the Adelaide College of Music, and then suddenly he left. Nobody knew why. I'll tell you why. He was not a reputable person, but anyway, he went back to England. Arrived back in England in 1892, became principal of the Hampstead Conservatorium of Music, and was dismissed because he wanted more money. So he wanted to take on private students to augment his pay. He began a major study of English folk music and folk dance. So he collected folk music and Morris dancing, all that sort of thing. But the other collectors, the National Board of Education and all the folk song societies wouldn't have anything to do with him. So he went broke. So he went to America during World War I. And he travelled throughout the Appalachian Mountains collecting folk music. He did it with Maud Capellis, a lady who would actually write down the music itself. His theory was that the music in the Appalachian Mountains was pure folk music. That is, in England, what they saw as folk music had been changed over the years by society. But in America, in the mountains, it was exactly as it was originally. And so if you wanted to know what true English folk music was, you went to the Appalachian Mountains and listened there, and you heard it. And that theory became really popular. And for 50 years after his death, everybody taught that. His associate, Capellis, wrote a biography, a rose-coloured biography, which increased his reputation. When I was in America doing research, this was part of it because I was looking at rural culture and music and how it was all affected. And I started to have some doubts about it. Now, I've since been reading stuff where other scholars were coming at that stage to the same sort of question marks. But I looked at it and I thought, it can't be right. Because the first problem is, it wasn't English folk music that we're talking about. In the mountains, you had English, Scottish, and Irish settlers. If they all settled together in an area, that's fine, but even if they didn't, they were close enough to each other that they influenced each other. And then that influenced those who weren't of that tradition. Now, I started to question it because I went to a place outside of Stanton, Virginia, called the National Museum of the Frontier, or something like that. And in that they have an English house from the early settlers, a Scottish house, an Irish house, a German house, a Dutch house, and 2 American farmhouses. And when you travel around, you look at the English house and the Scottish house, which I don't think is there anymore from reading the other day, the Irish house, the German, the Dutch. And when you go to the American farmhouse of 1800, you see they've begun to actually take bits of each of these to make the house. When you get to the American farmhouse at the end of the 19th century, you see exactly what they've done. They've taken the fireplace from the German one, and they've taken this and they've actually put them all together, made them suitable to the American situation, and come up with an American farmhouse using all of the good things out of each of the others. Now I thought, surely, if these people were together in the frontier, they would adapt each other's music. And I'm delighted to say that scholars far greater than I are starting to say the same thing now, which is good. But then I went out to some of the places where Cecil Sharp went. And I remember at one saying to an old guy, "What's that over there? That looks like a railway embankment, a railroad embankment." He said, "Oh yeah." He said, "That's where the Sunshine Special used to run." I said, "Oh yeah, when was it built?" "Oh, 1870. Stopped in the 1930s. I said, "Oh, okay, that's interesting." Now, you see, if the railroad came through, the first thing is 50% or more of the workers were black. And they brought their music with them because they sang it on the railroad, as they worked. So there's no way the music would stay the same. Secondly, once the trains come, people can actually go into the bigger cities to buy things, even if you only do it once a year, and you come into contact with their culture, so you come back and it changes. Now, looking at modern research, people are starting to say that too, which I felt really good that I'd done this before it had been said. But the thing that the modern books don't say is, I went into some places and I said, "When was that church built?" "Oh, that was built in 1875 after we had a revival at one of the Brush Harbour meetings. And then the circuit riders used to come and preach there, and now it's a proper Methodist church," and so on. Now, we're going to talk more about the circuit riders and the Brush Harbours later, but the music of those revivals was the music of Fanny Crosby and all of those. And that went right through the community because most people were religious. And there's no way the original music would not be changed. Now, I still haven't found any books that are talking about that, I must say. I think that I'm on my own there, but I'm pretty convinced that I'm right. So, all I'm saying is, what are great traditions in American history and American music history are not necessarily true. So I'll do the best to tell you the truth, all right? 2 key factors. There was no established church and there was no long tradition. No established church meant no government church. So the churches of America were set up by the Puritans, who were the nonconformists in England, and the Episcopal Church, which is the Anglican Church when it came, was never the largest church, was never government owned or anything like that. And so American religion grows up entirely different to the religion in England or in Australia, where when we came out here, Anglicans were initially supported by the government. It's a question mark of whether it was ever the established church, but probably was for a little while. So the American tradition is very, very different, and that affects their music. And the other thing is there was no long tradition. So you weren't looking at, what it was like at the Reformation, that sort of thing. They arrived and they had freedom to innovate. Americans have always loved innovation. And the other thing is they were anti-English. I mean, they kicked the mongrels out during the Revolution. You didn't want English stuff coming back. That's why it was never the Anglican Church, it was the Episcopal Church. You don't mention England at all. And so the English tradition is not as important there as it is anywhere else, as it was over here. And so they have an entirely different tradition. They're individualistic, much more so than in England. Like Australia, when you're in the frontier, it's sort of survival. That's all it is. And so you do your own thing. And there was a distrust of ecclesiastical power, so there's no central systems that are big and that control things. So you don't have a general synod saying, this prayer book is the one to use, or anything like that. If you did that in America, there'd be another revolution. So the Americans are far more fragmented, but therefore also very different in what they do. Now, one of the early things is that they started choral schools, singing schools. William Billings is the most famous, but there were singing schools everywhere. He was the first choral composer of note in America. Most of what he produced were four-part choruses, which later become Southern gospel music, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. He wasn't a very imposing character. He was addicted to snuff. He was only small. One leg was shorter than the other, and he had no care for his person. He looks all right there, but apparently he wasn't always clean, and he often smells and all that sort of thing. But his music was imposing. And the singing schools meant that you had a whole group of people in America who were taught to sing properly, which often didn't happen in England. And they were the ones who went out into churches and led the singing and taught people how to sing. You also had a big tradition of the Moravians and the Shakers. The Moravians we've talked about, the Shakers were different. They believed the second coming was imminent, and so their worship was ecstatic. They trembled, they shaked, they danced. I guess a forerunner of the modern charismatic movement in many ways. But they had a big influence. Initially, both the Moravians and the Shakers were isolated. They went into their own communities and they had nothing to do with anybody else. But when they came to America, the interesting thing was they brought instrument makers with them. Now, instrument makers were very important in a place that had nothing. And those instrument makers, obviously to make money, took their instruments all over the place, travelled all over the place. What do you do when you take an instrument to somebody? You play it. What do you play? Well, you play your music. And people say, oh, that's interesting, can we have a copy of that? And so although they were isolated, they tended to share their music with others. Now they had a long musical tradition, but as we said before with the Moravians and the Shakers, and later with the Charismatics, a lot of their stuff is ephemeral. It just doesn't last, it disappears, because it's written for the occasion. But eventually they made the mainstream, and when they made the mainstream, they actually had a big influence on church music. Now the other thing in America was the city versus country divide. It's true in England, you have the city churches and the rural churches. The city churches were rich, they could have choirs and organs and all sorts of things. The country churches often didn't have a great deal, but they're close enough to each other to influence each other. America is much bigger. The city churches replicated the old world. They imported much of their music from England, and when new music was written, it was written in the style of the English hymns. So you have American hymn writers who are indistinguishable from English hymn writers. And their hymns, when you play them, when you sing them in church, you couldn't tell the difference between Isaac Watts and all of those and the American hymn writers. The rural churches were very different. On the frontier, and what happened was Americans came to the east coast from England, the continent, usually as a result of religious persecution. That's why you get the non-conformists there, coming originally to Boston, but then New York becomes the big centre. But what happens is that people don't stay there, they actually move out into the frontier. And the frontier is always moving as people seek new land so they can make their living. Slightly different to Australia, although the same thing happened to some extent. And when you went out to the frontier, the first thing was you were isolated. There were no roads or anything like that. So, you went on a wagon train and fought the Indians and all that sort of thing, and the cowboys came and helped you and all that sort of stuff. Until the railroads went in the second half of the 19th century, there's not really much contact with back home, so you're isolated. You're hard working because you're living off the land, and the land is not always good to you. You're poor. Almost every rural area was poor, at least initially. Now eventually, of course, gold was discovered, all sorts of other things happened and places went ahead and did well, but on the frontier the basic rural person was poor, but he also had a strong religious faith. That was pretty standard. And America, of course, today still is far more religious than most other Western countries. But their religion was very primitive on the frontier. Theologically primitive and primitive in every other way. So the result was a need for evangelism and for teaching. Now the Methodists, I hate to think of what's happened to the Methodists in Australia and the Uniting Church and all that, but the Methodists were at the forefront of it all. They wanted to see people converted. And so they developed what were called the circuit riders. Preachers on horseback, sometimes clergy, sometimes laity, who would go out on horseback and spend time in a community, spend a few weeks there teaching, and then they'd move on to the next community. And that they'd do a circuit. And so each 6 months or each year, you would have one of the circuit riders for 2 weeks a month. And then in between, lay people who lived there would have to do it. Now, when the circuit riders went out, the first thing they did was to take a musician with them, a singing teacher, whose job it was not only to help with the worship of the service, but to teach people to sing. And so the music of Fanny Crosby and all of those others, that's what makes it popular, because it's simple, and that's the music the rural people could cope with. I went one night to a church in the middle of nowhere, and it was fascinating. The women had all made an effort to get dressed up, but you wouldn't have worn the dresses they wore to church here. And they were still wearing their work boots because that's all they had. And the singing was, it wasn't technically good, but it was so powerful and so full of emotion that you just couldn't help but be drawn in by it. It was absolutely incredible. And that's what it was like back in the 19th century. Now there was a lack of books and very poor education, and so these singing teachers developed what was called shape note singing. Now for a while I spent, well, I wasn't staying with Bill Walker, but I spent some time with him. Now Bill Walker is a graduate of the Conservatorium of Music in Sydney, worked in South Africa, then went to America, and became one of the great music producers of Nashville. Did the music for the Johnny Cash TV show. Has his own orchestra, or had his, he's died now, but he had his own orchestra, which travelled around the world, was very popular. New music back to front. And I said to him, Bill, I don't understand the shape note music. And he said to me, Denis, I don't understand it either. Now, he was a musical genius, he didn't understand it. He said, if you want to know about it, ask my wife, she can still sing it. But I gave up at that point. I thought, if he doesn't understand it, then it doesn't matter. But the idea was, instead of complex charts, the shape of the note conveyed how it was to be sung. And it was apparently easy to teach to these rural people. And so, as you can see, there are a whole lot of hymn books produced, and that was the singing that was done. But the result of that was there was a need for simple songs. And that's why the great gospel songs became so popular, because they actually suited the frontier. So, what about American hymn writers? George Bernard, Fanny Crosby, Philip Bliss. Let's go through some of them at least. George Bernard, 1873 to 1958. Best known for the Old Rugged Cross. Wrote a lot of other hymns, but that was the one that he was best known for, which we still sing, of course. Fanny Crosby and Philip Bliss we talked about last week. Now, Fanny Crosby was the simple gospel songs. Philip Bliss wrote music that was much more like the English hymnists. Albert E. Brumley, 1905 to 1977. He left a big tradition. I'll fly away, turn your radio on. If we never meet again, I'll meet you in the morning. These are the gospel songs that are being sung all over the place in America. His son has continued the tradition. Annie Hawkes, 1836 to 1918. I Need Thee Every Hour, which is still sung. William J. Kirkpatrick, 1838 to 1921. He wrote over 1,000 hymns. And the ones that we still sing, A Wonderful Saviour is Jesus My Lord. It's a beautiful tune. I don't know if we ever sing it these days, but it's lovely. I Am Not Skilled to Understand. We've had that. Jesus Save. I heard the joyful sound. Jesus saves, Jesus saves. Spread the message all around. Jesus saves. My faith has found a resting place. 'Tis so sweet to trust in Jesus. Again, a good tune that I haven't heard for ages. And Will Your Anchor Hold, which we have on our list for Wednesdays. So he was quite significant. Edgar M. Pace wrote more than 4,000 hymns, and he wrote them all for shape note singing. Jesus Is All I Need, Beautiful Star of Bethlehem, known, but I haven't heard any of them lately. Homer Roadheaver, 1880 to 1955. He was a musical director for Billy Sunday. Now, America has had three great evangelists. The first was Dwight L. Moody. I mean, they've had hundreds of evangelists, but the great ones were Dwight L. Moody, who ran crusades that are very much like Billy Graham crusades. A little more primitive, but the same sort of tradition. In between Dwight L. Moody and Billy Graham was Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday is a character. He's my favourite actually, because he was. No pulpit could hold Billy Sunday. He didn't preach from a pulpit. He would jump on chairs and jump on tables and roll on the floor and all sorts of things to get his message across. I would love to have heard one of his sermons, but he was quite spectacular. Roadheaver was the music director for Billy Sunday. His trombone, he actually used to use his trombone to direct the choirs and all that sort of thing. And he would use it to punctuate what he was saying. He was telling a story, he'd use it to punctuate that. His real influence, however, was he produced hymn books. Golden Bells, not the Golden Bells we use, but the original Golden Bells, was produced put together by him. And I think when Scripture Union put the Golden Bells that we're familiar with together, they actually based it on that. He did write hymns, but also as early as 1915 he was making recordings of gospel music. Now that's pretty early on. Not very influential, because it's all right to make a recording of it, but nobody can play it because nobody owns a listening device. So, but anyway, he was there doing that, so he was quite influential. George Cole Stebbins, 1846 to 1945. He was a friend of Moody and Sankey, a friend of P.P. Bliss, and a whole lot of others. Jesus is calling, have thine own way, Lord, take time to be holy. Again, have thine own way, Lord, probably better known as a solo, but in the hymn books. John Robson Sweeney, 1837 to 1889, Beulah Land. I haven't heard that since I was a kid, I have to say. Daniel B. Towner, 1850 to 1919, The Old Ship of Zion, which again is probably better known as a solo, and Trust and Obey, which we still sing. Indeed, that was what we sang at school. I went to a state high school, Wollongong High School, where the principal on the list of principals in seniority was number 1, so he could do whatever he wanted to. And every morning at 8:30, the entire school gathered together in the assembly hall for a minister to come and speak. And you couldn't get out of it. No point bringing a letter from your parents. That was torn up. You were told you were going to. There was a hymn. Trust and Obey was one of the favourites. A local minister would come. They'd take it in turns for a week. And then when they left, the principal would address the assembly with the information for the day. Then you go to class. You never get away with it now, but he did for years and years and years. Trust and Obey was one of those things. Daniel Webster Whittle was involved with the Moody Crusades. He was, again, a very prolific hymn writer, of which we still sing, I know whom I have believed, in Banners of the Cross. Now after that I've put dots on your notes because there are dozens of others, and I don't really want to go into them in detail, but dozens of others. Now you can see there you have the two traditions. You have those like Philip Bliss who wrote English style hymns, and most of the others, even Daniel Webster Whittle, those hymns are fairly, and George Bernard, they're English style hymns. And then you have others who write the gospel music of America. Now the brush arbors were very, very influential. These were revivals, and once you had a revival in the area, then you built a church, the circuit riders came in, and then when the place got big enough, you got a minister in. Now the brush arbors, all they did, they called brush arbors because you put up a few poles and put brush on top of it to keep the sun and the rain off, because they would go for a week or 2 weeks and people wouldn't go home. I mean, we're out in the country, so they travel to get there, and they would stay there for the whole 2 weeks or week or whatever. And there's a more modern one with people there all dressed up and everything. But basically, you would spend the day listening to sermons and being taught music and singing. And so the music as a part of that became just a part of all of society. And people would sing it all the time. And the evangelism meant there were conversions, and that spread through. Now, England had nothing like that. We had nothing like that. And that's one of the reasons why the gospel music of America is still so popular, because it was part of their culture. And when I was studying this, culture had such an influence on music, and music had such an influence on culture. Southern gospel music. Now, I was going to put some of this on display, but I didn't get around to it. It's hard work to do that sort of thing. Southern gospel music was very popular. It's usually 4 males, singing in harmony with a pianist. The hymns were usually written for shape note singing. They were simple, they were catchy tunes with powerful words, and they were used for evangelism. Now, if you want to know what Southern gospel music was like, can I suggest you go home, go onto YouTube and type in the Statler Brothers TV show. It was on for 7 years, and it always ended with a Southern gospel song. And there you have the Statler Brothers. On the left is Harold Reed, who was the bass singer. Phil Ballsy, the second one from the left. Ballsy was a tenor, I suppose. He is the guy with the weakest voice, but he's the one that held it together. Don Reed, the lead singer, and then Jimmy Fortune on the right. And the guy sitting at the piano was Bill Walker, that I mentioned. Go home and listen to some of those. Have a look at some of those. Listen to the piano for a start, and you'll get some idea why gospel music was so popular. Because Bill's playing is just amazing. And then if you listen to the right songs, you'll hear the four coming in harmony and that sort of thing. It's quite an experience. Now, the other influence on Christian music in America was Hollywood and Tin Pan Alley. Hollywood began in New York, but moved to California because of the weather. The problem in New York is it rained too often and you couldn't shoot the movies. But the music that Hollywood needed, for a start, for the silent movies, it had to be really catchy, and then when they had sound movies, it had to be popular and that sort of thing. Tin Pan Alley was responsible for producing the pop music today. It's a street in New York, and tradition was that it was the sound of people hitting pads, but the truth is it was the pianists composing tunes that they reckon sounded like hitting a tin pan. And most American pop music in the early days came out of Tin Pan Alley. Now, Christian music can't help but imbibe the popular culture. One of the things about folk music is you take a basic tune and you rewrite the words. So all of the early country music songs were old English folk tunes with the words rewritten. First of all, you can make them suit current events, and secondly, you rewrite them, you get copyright money for yourself, which was a great deal. So the great songs about, the wreck of the old 97, the railways, they're all based on old English tunes. Okay, pop tunes are great. And so suddenly you start to have religious words being written to them. So people can, in church, not in sophisticated city churches, but out in the country, they sing tunes that are pop tunes with religious words. Now, one of the prime examples, for example, is country singer Jack Green, who I met at the Grand Ole Opry. He had a big hit called "You Are My Everything," which was a love song. He then re-recorded it as "He Is My Everything," gospel song. Same tune, makes twice as much money because you've now got a pop song and a religious song. That sort of thing happened over and over again. And then once radio came in, and the radio comes in the mid-1920s, obviously the churches get involved, and so you have all these religious programs. And the religious programs have music, and the music they play is mostly the frontier music, because you want to get out to people out there. And then recordings will enable you to take the music out there as well. Now, on top of that, secular artists begin to record religious music. Country music, which is my area of expertise, almost every religious artist included in their repertoire a religious song. Almost all of them would record a religious album because it sells. Now, a lot of them are actually Christians, which is good, but not all of them are, but they still put it there. I remember going to a show at Penrith Panthers. She would make no pretense to being a Christian, and as far as I know, never recorded any Christian music. But in the middle of her set, there was a punch-up. And so she had to stop, and of course, when things quieted down, she opened up with Amazing Grace. So even a secular artist realised that this is the way to calm people down and to do it. So some of the songs that were written became favourites. Most of them disappeared. Just a Closer Walk with Thee is an example of a song that was a pop song that became quite popular. All right, that's American music, but it has a big influence because America influences everything we do. Hymn books, we'll start that before we stop for lunch. That's a bookshelf with a couple of hymn books on it. I started looking at different hymn books. I got to over 300 and thought, no, this is a waste of time. 1,000, I got 30 pages and I was still going, so I thought, no, don't worry about that. So what we're going to do with hymn books is we're going to be very, very selective in what we look at and only look at what we use. Now, why do you have hymn books? Well, you have hymn books so people can sing hymns, of course. But there were different reasons for them. Some were published by authors. So John Newton and William Cowper published the Olney Hymns, which was a hymn book just of the hymns that they'd written. And that was probably the most popular hymn book of the Evangelical Revival. You have hymn books that are published by publishers because there's money in a hymn book. You publish a hymn book and the church buys it, well, they buy 200, 300 copies. This big city church, 1,000 copies or more. And so you make a lot of money out of it. And a lot of those publishers would sign writers to write hymns for their hymn book. So Fanny Crosby, as I said last week, she was under contract to write 3 hymns a week for a music publisher who bought 4,500 of her hymns to publish and made money out of them. Some are published by denominations. So in the Anglican Church you have hymns ancient and modern. And then we said hymns ancient and mouldy, which is what we always used to call it, but hymns ancient and modern, which is the classic Anglican hymn book. But there have been others. The Anglican hymn book itself, for example, was produced. Most denominations have their own hymn book. So the Methodists had a hymn book. In America, the Old Brown Hymn Law was called. The Baptists have their own hymn book. Published by organisations. So when I was at university, the University Press published a hymn book. I think it was called Hymns of Faith from memory. It was never very popular, but they published it. Published for special occasions. So the original Moody Sancti hymn books were published for the Moody Sancti Crusades. And of course the Billy Graham hymn books have been produced for Billy Graham Crusades, and each crusade has their own hymn book. Published on themes, Scripture in Song is an example of that, and psalm praise and so on. And published by groups, Hymns for Today's Church, which was popular for a little while in some places, Anglicans, was published by a group of English clergy who got together, and all evangelical, I hate to admit it, got together and revised all of the hymns to update them, and then claimed copyright on the revisions, and they made the money. So I always thought that was a really rotten thing to do, but anyway, my stance is different to others. Method, The hymn book was produced, and then a supplement will be produced because some hymns were not included that people wanted. So people say, oh, why didn't you include this? So they would produce a supplement. And then the next time the printing was made, the supplement would be included. Usually still as an appendix at the back, but it would be included. And then they'd come out with a revised edition, and in the revised edition they'd remove the hymns that weren't being sung regularly and then add a whole lot of new ones. Now it's not bad, you see, because you buy a hymn book and you've got to buy the supplement, and then you've got to buy the revised edition, and so you end up spending a fortune on hymn books. It's what school textbook writers do as well. A mate of mine, Jeff Connolly, wrote the geography, Connolly and Cox and Connolly, the geography textbook. And Jeff used to buy a new car each year on the proceeds of that, because every 18 months or so they'd put out a new edition because they'd update all the statistics and add a few bits and pieces. And of course schools would have to buy, these ones start to fall apart, you'd have to buy the new one, and that was different to the old one, so you had to buy a full set of the new ones because you couldn't use the old ones anymore. And it's not bad. Hymn writers do that as well. Problems? Well, some hymns were not popular. So, you know, when you commit yourself to a print of 100,000 copies, for example, of a hymn book, and it contains hymns that nobody's going to sing, that's not much good. And if you don't have enough of the popular hymns, your book's not going to sell, so you could lose money. New hymns are always becoming available, and some of those are quite good, and so you want to include them. People request the new hymns or different hymns. Oh, you know, why isn't such and such there? And the other thing is copyright problems. A hymn book publisher has to get copyright for all of the hymns, and sometimes that's hard. I don't know what it's like these days, but I can remember back in the 60s and 70s, hymn books coming out with a statement, we have attempted to check up with all the copyright holders, but we can't find some of them. And, you know, so there are those problems. Copyright is an issue. Copyright was paid as part of book sales, so authors got from that. Now that creates problems now because we don't have books anymore, and that's why we have a different system with a copyright organisation, so that each time a song is sung, the fee goes to the organisation, and then supposedly it goes to the author, although since some of them have been dead for a long time, you don't know where it goes, I suppose. But the copyright is now assigned not to the author but to these organisations. Copyright itself runs out after 25 years or 50 years, depending on where you are. And the other thing, the dishonest thing, is often publishers change the words and copyright the new version. They keep the copyright. I find this whole thing really shocking because once the copyright is run out, you shouldn't be paying anything for it. And but even then, there are questions. Is hymn writing a gift from God? Should you therefore make money out of it? I don't know. Obviously, people have got to live, so I guess they've got to do that. But it really is a problem, and it's an increased problem because of what happens with modern churches. You see, we have photocopying. So you don't need a hymn book anymore, you can just photocopy the hymns that you want. Photocopying is recent, you realise that? I mean, I've got 2 university degrees before photocopies were invented. You spend all your time sitting in the library, writing notes by hand. Life is so much easier now. Or for church, if you wanted to teach a new hymn, and when I was at Annandale, I had a warden who used to write new hymns, you'd get the Gestetner and you'd run copies off. and then you'd spend the next 3 days trying to get the ink off your hands, you know. It was a horrible, messy process. Then we had overheads, you know, the old overhead projector, and now of course we have PowerPoint. So the result is that we can have a much wider variety of hymns than we've ever had before. We can have hymns that have just been written, and we include them and see if they're any good, and if they're no good, we just throw that away, wipe it off the PowerPoint, we don't need to use it again. We can have hymns from different sources. We don't have to have one hymn book. The music people can have 50 hymn books and pick bits out of each one. So hymn books now are anachronistic. They really are quite limiting. But the result is that everywhere you go, people are singing different hymns and songs. And so you go to a church and they're singing one of their favourites, you've never heard it before. And a lot of the old favourites die out. The other thing is, in the old days, regional hymns would often find their way in a hymn book and therefore become universal. Nowadays, they stay regional because there's no central source for them. So, it's changed the way we do church music. It's a whole lot better in that we have so much more choice. It's a whole lot worse in that we no longer have a common source for music. And I'll finish with this. I told you this, I think in the first week. I'll tell you again. Being at a concert at Dollywood in America, having a Southern Gospel group do an hour show, and in the middle of it, having 3 songs, they said, all right, your turn, you sing it. And I sat there with, 500, 700 people. And I looked around, and they were obviously weren't church people, but everybody was singing. And it was really moving, really moving. And I went down afterwards, was talking to the group, and I said, I learnt those 3 things in Australia in the 1950s, 1960s. So here I am in the hills of Tennessee, singing songs with you people that I learned. And that won't happen in the future because we won't have that common tradition. Let's leave it there and we'll go on to hymn books afterwards. Hymns Ancient and Modern, or Hymns Ancient and Mouldy, is the traditional Anglican hymn book. The one on the left is the original, goes back to 1861, and there's been a number of other editions, and then the latest Hymns Ancient and Modern, the New Standard Edition. Hymns Ancient and Modern came out of the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement, or the Tractarians, was an attempt to move the church back to its ancient traditions before the Reformation. The evangelical revival produced no common hymn book. The Olney hymns is probably the most popular. The Oxford movement produced Hymns Ancient and Modern, which has become the standard Anglican hymn book, I guess, all over the world. And the publisher is now quite substantial. They produce theological books and hymn books and all sorts of other things. They've bought out other publishers, including the SCM Press. Hymn singing in nonconformist churches was popular, but in Anglican churches it wasn't great. And the evangelical churches were using the Olney hymns, a thing called the Lock Hospital Collection, and of course a collection of hymns for the use of people called Methodists, which not only the Methodists used but others used as well. But the Oxford movement returned us to the early traditions, and so a lot of the hymns in Ancient and Modern were translations of Latin and Greek and German hymns. And so there are a number of translators, starting from the left, and then we go down, up, down, I think is the way it works. John Chandler, 1806 to 1876, he published Hymns of the Primitive Church in 1837. And the only one of those that we still sing are On Jordan's Banks the Baptist's Cry. Anybody heard that?
Yes.
Yeah, right, there you go. Second, down the bottom, John Mason Neale, 1818 to 1866. He translated Good King Wenceslas, All Glory, Lord and Honour, and O come, Emmanuel, and Jerusalem the Golden. The interesting thing you'll notice from this is that when you go back to the ancient hymns, a lot of them are related to Christmas and Easter, because that's when they were sung. Thomas Helmore, 1811 to 1890, second on the top. He produced the original tunes for Neale's translations, but then did a few himself. Christ was born on Christmas Day, and Good Christian Men Rejoice. Which of course you can't sing anymore because you can't sing sexist songs, can you? Edward Caswell, second on the bottom, 1814 to 1878. He was an Anglican who became a Roman Catholic priest, and his hymns were very Catholic, and most of his hymns only survive in the Catholic tradition. They didn't even survive in ancient and modern. Jane Laurie Borthwick, 1813 to 1897. She was from the Scottish Free Church, which is very interesting, but she translated German hymns under the pen name of HLL. And you can tell where that comes from, Hymns from the Land of Luther. She was fascinated by German hymnody. The Golden Sunbeams is the only one that I could find that was still in some books. But we published books of German hymns. I couldn't find a photograph of her. So you got a photograph of the book instead. Catherine Winkworth, fascinated by, Borthwick, no, I'm reading the wrong thing. Be still my soul and my Jesus as thou wilt. Catherine Winkworth, Golden Sunbeams. So the first thing of the hymns, ancient and modern, I keep wanting to say mouldy, I'm sorry. Forgive me if it slips out. With the translations. But then there were new hymns written by Anglican clergy. So Henry Alford, top left, 1810 to 1871. 4 would be our watchword, 10,000 times 10,000. Alford was better known, not for his hymns, but for his 8-volume Greek New Testament. And the reason that he was so well known is that his work was philological, not theological. In other words, he was more interested in the language than the theology. And that changed the way Greek New Testaments were produced from that day on. Henry Williams Baker, sitting at the table, 1821 to 1877. Oh, praise ye the Lord, the King of love my shepherd is. And he was the major force behind hymns ancient and modern. We'll talk about that in a minute. There's a guy in the middle, Sabin Baring Gould, 1834 to 1924. Onward Christian soldiers, and now the day is over. Onward Christian soldiers, of course, popular because it was put to a tune by Arthur Sullivan of Gilbert and Sullivan fame. He didn't see his hymn writing as being very important. His principal achievement, he thought, was a collection of folk songs. And that was very interesting because a lot of the folk songs are rude. So he left the rude bits out, or he changed them, he tidied them up. But in his papers, he left the originals. So after he died, people could still get back to the original. Yeah. He wrote novels, He wrote a 16-volume Lives of the Saints. Not bad. And he was also busy, he had 15 children. So, I suppose he locked himself in study to write all those things to get away from his kids. John Keble down the bottom, on the right, 1792 to 1866. He was one of the original leaders of the Oxford movement, wrote some of the original tracts, they became known as the Tractarians. Blessed are the pure in heart is the one that we still sing. And then the reprobate on the right was Christopher Wordsworth, 1807 to 1885. He was a nephew of William Wordsworth, as a poet. 7 of his hymns went into Hymns Ancient and Modern, but none of them are still sung. They were the clergy, but there were some laymen who were hymn writers. Matthew Bridges, 1800 to 1894, Crown Him with Many Crowns. William Chatterton Dix, 1837 to 1898, As with Gladness Men of Old, What Child Is This? And Alleluia Sing to Jesus. And Folliot Sanford Pierpont, 1835 to 1917, For the Beauty of the Earth. Now, what I'm telling you here is Hymns Ancient and Modern collected these old hymns translated into English and also had a lot of new hymn writers. So it wasn't just a collection of hymns, it actually had a whole lot of new stuff. Now, all right, I'll tell you a little bit about its beginnings. William Denton, in 1835, put together a thing called the Church Hymnal. And Francis Murray put together a book called Hymnal for the Use of the English Church. Denton and Murray met on a train, talked about their hymn books and discussed how good it would be to put out a single book. At the same time, Henry Baker, who we've looked at, and the Reverend P. Ward were working on a similar scheme for other hymn books. And so the four of them got together and suggested one book. Clergy wanted more uniformity in hymns, they didn't like everybody singing different hymns. And so in 1858 they began work with a committee of 20. 1858 was produced in 1861, so they worked fairly quickly. They asked for assistance, advertised in the High Church newspaper, The Guardian, and 200 clergymen responded with suggestions. Not bad. Now, John Keble, who I said was really the founder of the Oxford movement, so he's at the centre of this movement of what we now call the High Church. He suggested the book needed to be comprehensive. In other words, don't just write a book for the Oxford movement, produce a book that everybody can use, including the evangelicals. And that made a big difference to its reception. They used a variety of resources, not just the four hymn books they were starting with. Henry Baker, who we've talked about, he was the chairman for 20 years, and it's his attitude that led to its success. It was the first hymn book to ever publish words and music together. That had never happened before. It was an immediate success. Between 1861 and 1961, it sold 170 million copies. And by 2024, in all of its versions, it had sold over 200 million copies. The first edition in 1861 had 273 hymns. 7 years later, an appendix was added. The second edition was in 1875, and then a new and revised edition in 1904, and then a complete edition in 1906, which brought together everything that had been there. And in that was published for the last time in 1916, and then a standard edition came out in 1922, a revised edition in 1950, a new standard edition in 1983. In 2000, a book called Common Praise came out, which was based on it. 2010, Sing Praise, which was 330 recently written hymns, songs and chants. And in 2013, the latest, Ancient and Modern, which was subtitled Hymns and Songs for Refreshing Worship. And unlike the original, which had 273, it had 847. Now, that was the hymn book that was used worldwide in much of the Anglican Church. And it was certainly used in this diocese. It was the basic hymn book in this diocese when I was growing up, which is why it's hymns ancient and mouldy, because that's what we thought of it as. The next hymn book that would have had an impact on all of us was Alexander's, Hymns number 3, the Red Book. J. Wilbur Chapman on the left was an evangelist, 1859 to 1918. He was a Presbyterian, and he began preaching with Dwight Moody in 1893. In other words, he was an associate evangelist to Moody. He had a strong influence on Billy Sunday, who I've already mentioned, who was one of my favourites. He began missions in 1907 in Philadelphia with a team of evangelists and song leaders, and then toured the world. His song leader on the right was Charles M. Alexander. The thing that I like most about Charles M. Alexander is he married Helen Cadbury, the daughter of the Cadbury Chocolate Company founder. So I reckon he was a lucky guy. That was my view anyway. But Alexander's first came out in 1909. The Chapman-Alexander mission team conducted missions in Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Japan, Korea, and then North America. In Australia, they conducted major missions in Melbourne, Sydney, Ipswich, Brisbane, Adelaide, Ballarat, Bendigo, and Townsville. And there were thousands of conversions. And that's why Alexander's is so popular in Australia. Because lots of people converted at those crusades, those missions, would have used the book. And they take it back to the church, and people say, oh, that's good. Chapman believed in the inerrancy of Scripture, so he got rid of evangelists who didn't believe in that, and he considered the music ministry to be particularly important. Number 3 was published in 1920 for the first time, had 306 hymns, had a red cover, and it had an Australian edition, so we could say it was ours. It was published in Melbourne, in fact. And in the 1970s it was still being used. Now, the thing about Alexander's is it was basically Sankey's hymn book, with a whole lot of things updated and a whole lot of new stuff. But it was a gospel hymn book. It had a lot of the old hymns, but it was basically a gospel book. The one that many of us grew up on, of course, was Golden Bells, except they were green in my day, I thought, but anyway. And it was published first by Scripture Union in 1925 for youth gatherings and Sunday schools. A mixture of old hymns, but a lot of children's hymns and a lot of gospel songs. Because it was published for Sunday schools, the music was always too high for churches. And that was one of the drawbacks. It was our hymn book at Mount Druitt, and the organist there, John Chalker, was a musical genius. He used to transpose it by sight as he played it, to bring it down so people could sing it. And a lot of those hymns were just brilliant. And we still sing some of them. We sing some of them here because that's the one that I loved. Simple, as as I say, some of those schools and youth. Began with 130 hymns, but eventually with 738 hymns through the various editions. The one that I grew up with in church was the Book of Common Praise. The Book of Common Praise, with an Australian supplement, was approved by use of the General Synod, published by the Melbourne University Press, but it began in 1908 with the Church of England in Canada. It says in the introduction, I read the introduction the other day, the life of a hymn book is 25 years. So there you go. He went through numerous printings, therefore, and it was designed for all legitimate, I quote, for all legitimate schools of thought within the Church of England. Right? So it didn't matter if you were evangelical, charismatic, high church, liberal, you'd find something in it. And it had a lot of the good old hymns, and then it had gospel sections, it had and some church year and gospel sections and that sort of thing. It's what they sang when I first went to church, and I still think it's the best hymn book I've ever seen, but anyway, I'm getting old. Two then that became popular are Scripture in Song and Psalm Praise. Scripture in Song is New Zealand, a New Zealand effort produced by David and Dale Garrett, who met at a 1968 Youth for Christ rally, began to sing together and then make records, and then they produced 3 books, one in 1979, one in 1981, one in 1988. They wrote some of the stuff and they got their friends to write other stuff. Again, most of it hasn't survived, but some of it has, some of the good ones survived. You cannot just take scripture verses and turn them into song. That's the bottom line. It doesn't work. And of course, one of the most popular songs from it, which I used to tear my heart out. I used to scream when somebody would play it, was, "My beloved is mine and I am his, and his banner over me is love." And people loved it. They played it all the time. I used to stand up and say, "That's the only pornographic part of scripture. Can you explain to me what it means? It comes from the Song of Solomon. It's rude." "Oh no, it's about Christ." You know, no. You mustn't twist scripture like that. But anyway. And then Psalm Praise, compiled by Bishop Michael Bourne, who's still alive actually. Getting on now, he's in his 90s. He was rector of All Souls Langham Place after John Stott became Bishop of Chester. It was published in 1973. The most famous song from it, of course, is "Tell Out My Soul." It was published by the Church Pastoral Aid Society. The Church Pastoral Aid Society is interesting. It's an evangelical group in England who came into being back in the 19th century. Now, in the old days, a lot of Church of England churches were owned by the local lord. And so the living was in the hands of the local lord. He got to appoint the clergyman, he paid the clergyman, that sort of thing. And when that began to fall out of fashion, the Church Pastoral Aid Society was formed to buy the livings. So they would go to the Lord and say, we'll give you £100 for the right to... And so this evangelical group got to control a large number of churches in England. Very powerful. If I may be permitted a personal story, in my ordination retreat, you had to go away for a few days, and you had somebody talking about ministry and somebody doing Bible studies. The guy doing Bible studies was the secretary of the Church Pastoral Aid Society, and he came to me one morning, sat me down, and he said, "Listen, how would you like a church in England?" He said, "You can have a rural church, I've got dozens I can give you, or I'll give you a curacy with John Stott, one of the great ones if you want it. Come across and work for us." And I said, "No, I can't, because the Diocese of Sydney has paid for my training, and therefore You know, I really got to give back. I was so naive, because looking back on it later, why did he talk to me and nobody else? Because I had preached at Darwin Point regularly to Marcus Sloan, and Marcus Sloan had said to him, he's all right, get him. And if Marcus Sloan had said, oh, you can have me, I didn't have to worry about scholarships and things. So I watch Midsummer Murders and I look at the church and I think, gee, I could have been rector there, but anyway. And then when we produced our own prayer book, the Australian prayer book, we produced our own hymn book, the Australian hymn book, 1977. 10 years of work by an ecumenical committee. The ecumenical committee consisted of Anglican, Congregational, Methodist and Presbyterians. Notice who's missing?
Thanks.
The Baptists. The Baptists don't have anything to do with anybody else. They do their own thing. They've still got the best hymn books, but we'll forget that. They got a Roman Catholic supplement. That was actually edited by Father John Walsh, later Monsignor John Walsh. He was the Catholic priest at Annandale when I was the Anglican minister there. We used to play squash every week and have our theological controversies on the squash court. He was a lovely guy, and he said to me one day, I was trained in philosophical theology, you were trained in the Bible, would you come and run some Bible studies for my people because they need it? And so I used to go to his church and do that. He'd come to my church and preach every now and then. The Australian hymn book was very popular with the Uniting Church, but not with many others. Left out too many old favourites. And so there was a survey in 1990, and that led to Together in Song in 1999. Basically what it did, it included a whole lot of new stuff, but it also included a whole lot of old favourites that had disappeared. Still never put in the great evangelical favourites, but we'll forget that. The modernisation of the words occurred, including inclusive language. There were 783 psalms, hymns and spiritual songs. The committee was chaired by the Reverend Laurie Bartlett, who was rector of Vaucluse in Sydney, and it was made up of the Anglican, Churches of Christ, Lutheran, Presbyterian, Roman Catholic and United. So it's much wider, but you'll notice missing still the Baptists, who didn't need it because they still had the best hymn book. There were no printings after 2017. So once we got in here, we're going to become worth a fortune one day because there's been none printed since 2017. The reason is the publisher decided not to renew copyright licenses because of the changes in copyright as I talked about. Still leaves out too many good songs, I've got to say. And then there's Mission Praise, which began in November 1983. There are 2 or 3 volumes now. It was initially designed for the Billy Graham at Mission England rallies of 1983. And so it's a Billy Graham book, really. Contains a lot of good old stuff, but a lot of the gospel songs and a lot of new stuff. All of these hymn books leave out hymns that are questionable, like Onward Christian Soldiers. It's not in any of them. Well, you can't have something about war. Oh. Forget what the Bible says. And there are others left out as well. Compiled by Peter Horrobin and Greg Levers. The Church of Scotland and the Church of England both approved, which is a big deal. The Billy Graham edition had 282 songs. The current 2 volumes have over 1,000. It does not use gender-neutral language. Whoopee! I love it. I have to say the major criticism of the Together in Song is that inclusive language ruined the flow of many of the older hymns. They just don't fit. So Mission Praise didn't do that. First major hymn book to be available online. There you go. That's quite something. And the 2015 edition had 1,021 hymns. So we had that together in song here until I became the locum, and then I found 78 good old hymns that weren't in either. So I produced our own, which COVID put an end to. There are others. There's the Anglican hymn book. That's what we used in college. It was not ever very popular. It contained a lot of good hymns, but the tunes were all wrong. And it used to drive me up the wall. You'd have these beautiful hymns, great old hymns, and the tunes were wrong. They were pathetic. The Baptist hymn book and the Methodist hymn books, they were both better because they were meant to be sung. And then, of course, there's all the modern stuff, the charismatic movement. That's a Hillsong collection, but there are lots and lots of them. The problem with them is the same as the Moravians. It's all ephemeral, heavily based on emotion. It's often a performance rather than a congregational thing. But like all previous hymn movements, most of it will be confined to the dustbin of history. Some of it will survive and will become classics, and in 50 years' time you won't know they were charismatic, so they were just typical hymns of the day. The biggest problem for the charismatics is the desire for new stuff all the time, so even their good stuff doesn't hang around very long. That's a problem. You know, if you don't have a hymn through a generation or two, it's not going to last. Now, when I was teaching at Penrith Christian School, they're all charismatics, we used to have a Bible study, staff Bible study every morning. We used to sing a hymn, or a song, sorry. I remember one day a girl saying, "Look, I've got to apologise, but this is an old song, but it's appropriate." I looked it up, it was 3 years old. I thought, you apologise for something? No. And that's the biggest problem with their music. Even the stuff that's good will be lost because they don't sing it over and over. They get rid of it. One of the most important influences on evangelical music, of course, the Billy Graham songbooks. Moody and Sankey had their Sankey's songs and solos, but Billy Graham had hymn books for each crusade. There's the Australia 59 crusade book, I believe. Cliff Barrows was the musical director, and George Beverly Shea was the baritone singer, bass singer, whatever. The music George Beverly Shea sang had nothing to do with young people. So all the old stuff. In a way, young people loved it. They really loved it. And of course, they popularised so many of the gospel songs. Not only did you have that, but you had all the associate evangelists. On the top left is Leighton Ford, who was Billy Graham's brother-in-law. Leighton Ford was a far superior preacher to Billy Graham, but never quite as successful. And then Grady Wilson, is one of the two there. On the right at the top, Joe Blinker, and that's not a moustache, that's Getty Images across his face. Joe Blinker was the evangelist who, where I got my call to the ministry from listening to him in one of his crusades, working as a counsellor at it actually. Louis Palau, the South American, and then John Wesley White. They all had musical teams. They all had a musical director and a soloist. Louis Palau, soloist, is a member of the congregation at Tea Gardens. And boy, can he sing. Absolutely brilliant, beautiful. But they all had soloists. So the Billy Graham Crusades all followed the standards of Moody and Sankey and Billy Sunday. Music was a very important part. The future, fragmentation, We're all singing different things, and I think that's a pity. Loss of the old hymns. It's good to have new stuff, but you shouldn't lose the old. And a lot of the new stuff actually isn't as good as the old. People disenfranchised from common worship because they don't know the new hymns. You go to a different church, they sing different stuff. They know it, you don't know it. It can be very difficult sometimes. And age groups are becoming even more separated. The 8 o'clock congregation, if it's not 100 years old, we don't want to sing it. But that is actually meaning that congregations are now fragmented. And that's a pity. We really need to get together, which is why we need a mixture of them all. Back to the Bible. What are we doing when we sing together on Sunday? Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly. It has to be biblical. I don't care how good the tune is, if it's not a biblical message, it's not acceptable in church. Sing it somewhere else, that's fine. But it's got to be consistent with the Bible. I love the hymns of Charles Wesley because you get a theological textbook in every hymn. And that's great. And that's the big thing about the old hymns. They tend to be really theological. They are meant to teach and admonish one another with all wisdom. So they are actually meant to be sung to each other together. It's got to be a common thing, and it's got to be a teaching tool. So it's got to actually say something that's important for teaching. Through psalms and hymns and songs from the spiritual songs. In other words, we need variety. And whatever those three terms mean, we need to have the psalms, we need to have hymns, and we need to have, if you like, I think spiritual songs are probably the gospel type songs. That'd be my interpretation, and then they need to be sung to God with gratitude in your heart. So if it's being sung, if it's not a good hymn, or it's being played like a funeral dirge, I have no gratitude in my heart. And I stand up at the front watching, and my wife is having because it's so slow, and everybody around is laughing because they feel the same way. And there's no gratitude to God in that. So our music has to be the message of Christ, designed to teach and admonish one another through a variety of songs sung with gratitude to God. And that, folks, is it for the history of Christian music, and I'm now exhausted.